If a person who seeks spiritual advice is deeply sincere, his desire to submit to the will of God, if there is a deep connection of love, of trust, of respect, Lord may enlighten the priests gracefully to give the correct answer, and for this Christian to benefit greatly.
Bishop Serafim of Sozopol is a hierarch of the Old Calendar Orthodox Church of Bulgaria, a sister church of the Church of the Genuine Orthodox Christians of Greece. His Grace is a visiting lecturer at the St. Photios Orthodox Theological Seminary, and all of us in Etna are very happy when he is able to visit us in person. In this episode, we discuss with Bishop Serafim the role of obedience in Orthodox Christian life. As I pour this tea into your cup, and by the way, Bishop Serafim selected jasmine tea. I know other hierarchs have chosen Greek mountain tea. That's usually a common one for hierarchs, but today we're going to go jasmine. But as I was saying, as I'm going to be pouring the tea in for Bishop Serafim, I'm going to be asking him the first question regarding obedience, and it's pretty simple. It's just for us to know, what is obedience from an Orthodox Christian perspective?
To put it in the simplest possible words, obedience means to do what you're told to do. Looking at it from the Christian perspective, obedience is a virtue. It is a virtue, and we have the model of this virtue in Christ himself, as Christ himself was a perfect example of obedience. So, to develop this virtue, we need to follow Christ as a model, to follow his example, to emulate him, to follow the entirety of his teaching, because it encompasses the concept of Christian obedience. And the perfect example of obedience, the perfect fulfillment of obedience are supposed to be the monks, as they align their will through the commandments of their spiritual superiors to the will of God. Obedience, Christian obedience as a virtue, is an act of submitting your will to the will of God. And why do we need to submit our will to the will of God? We are given absolutely free will by God. Because after the fall, the will of man was greatly distorted, and it submitted the other faculties of human soul. So, to restore the pristine, the initial balance in our soul, we need to submit our distorted will to the will of God. And the fulfillment of this is very different for monastics and very different for lay people. For example, lay people are supposed to submit to the teaching of Christ, to the gospel, to the teaching of the church. Lay people, they submit to the church, they submit their will to the church by following the teaching of faith that is offered by the church, that is confessed by the church. Lay people, they submit to the church in the face of their hierarchy by following the administrative direction of the hierarchy, the ruling bishops, and by being obedient to the discipline measures that in certain moments are applied to them. Monastics, as you know, they give a vow of full obedience to their superiors, which means that they do everything what they're told by their superiors, their abbots. And this is the most direct way to sanctity. The monastic obedience is a deliberate martyrdom. As the will of monk, it goes through a violent death to align with the will of God.
Let's have a sip of this so it doesn't get too cold.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
I'm curious.
All right, jasmine tea, here we go.
Jasmine tea.
This was tea that was donated for the show by Simeon, actually.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, he gave it to us. Simeon's one of the students here at the seminary. Now, you did mention that there is a difference between obedience for laymen and obedience for monastics. If we can go a little bit deeper into that. I've had conversations with people that say that since I'm a lay person, I don't necessarily have to follow all the rules.
Yes, first about the rules. Laymen are not obliged to obey to their spiritual father the way the monastics are obliged. Secondly, laymen are not obliged to have a life in deliberate poverty and chastity. So these are the true rules that differentiate laymen and monastics. In all the rest, there is no difference. Because laymen and monastics are supposed to follow the teachings, the commandments of Christ. As a general rule, to obey the commandments of Christ and the Church, there is no difference between laymen and monastics. The fact that a person is a layman doesn't liberate him or her from the obedience of the rules of our faith, which were, again, commandments of God, the rules of the Church, the canonical corpus of the Church, which is applied according to the pastoral discretion of the spiritual fathers or the Church hierarchy. So, again, it usually depends on the particular case, but generally, no one is exempted from the necessity to follow the rules of the Church.
There's something else I definitely wanted to mention before I forget. How is being obedient to your parents, and even being obedient to a spiritual father, so who is also sort of a parent figure, right? How is that connected to being obedient to God?
You're not required by the Holy Scripture to be obedient to your parents. You're not required to do everything your parents ordered you when you're adult. Of course, it is very essential for a child to have the experience of obedience to her or his parents, because in this way the child learns the concept of obedience, which helps him or her to be obedient to God in his adult life. But in Christian life, obedience is always considered in the content of love, respect, and trust. So, obedience to parents may be an expression of love, trust, respect, but it's not required.
So generally speaking, are there times where it's all right to be disobedient to authority?
To authority in general.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take civil authorities. If the commandments of civil authority are against your conscience, you are obliged to be obedient to God and not to authorities, which was the case in communist countries.
But I mean, if like the government does something that's not necessarily against Christianity, but is sort of like, it's like unfair to the people, you know, when that happens, what should we do? And I guess it is kind of hard to answer that because I'm not being too specific, but
again, I think that it's nothing wrong if Christians express their disagreement with something that is against their conscience. For example, unfairness is against Christian conscience. If we speak about the church, again, you are obliged to be obedient of the teaching of the church rules in general. If we speak about relations between a layman and his spiritual father, his confessor, is the layman obliged to be obedient to his spiritual father? No, there is not such requirement, because he or she didn't take the vows of obedience. So, for the layman, spiritual father is more like a father, a person who gradually, with the time, wins the respect and trust of the layman. He is more like an advisor. And if a layman does not agree to the advices or directions of the spiritual father, it is normal to openly express opinion, to discuss the issue with the spiritual father. And usually when there is respect and openness on both sides, the best solution is found. Generally speaking, a layman is supposed to comply with the advices of his spiritual father, again stress on advices, if they align with his or her conscience and common sense.
So what should a layman do if he's having confession with his or her spiritual father, and the spiritual father gives them advice that is kind of odd? You know what I mean? Like, for example, let's just say someone says, I committed this sin the other day, and then the spiritual father says, don't worry about it. That's not a big deal. And then the layman person says, kind of did seem like a big deal to me. I think a lot of times laymen might think themselves, well, should I go to another priest and ask him about this? Is that like an appropriate thing to do if you're unsure about something your spiritual father told you? Or should you, what else should you do maybe?
First of all, the approach to such a situation, again, be very open and sincere with your spiritual father. Discuss, explain why you are confused with this advice of the spiritual father. If the problem persists, of course, everyone is free to choose another spiritual father. No one is tied or obliged to go to one priest. Everyone is free to choose his or her spiritual father. And again, the relations between a layman, between a spiritual child and a spiritual father, are based on trust, on love. And it takes time. These relations to be built, relations of trust and love. From history we know, and from the life of the saints we know of cases when there were gifted or spiritual fathers who had the graceful gift from God, who had a prophetic gift from God to deliver God's message to the inquiry of certain individuals. In church history, these persons, these holy persons, were called usually elders. We know about the Etna elders, we know about some elders in Greece. But these were unique cases, which were so rare in past times of society filled with grace and piety. And in our times, it is almost impossible to find a certain person with such a graceful gift. But priests are ordained, and this ordination communicates grace to them. So why we do not have the same attitude towards the priest's capacity to deliver the will of God to person, to laymen, to the Christians? The priests have the grace to administer the services, to administer the holy mysteries, but they do not have this full prophetic grace. Of course, in certain instances, Lord enlightens their mind and directs them how to lead or help spiritually their spiritual children. If a person who seeks spiritual advice is deeply sincere, his desire to submit to the will of God, if there is a deep connection of love, of trust, of respect, Lord may enlighten the priests gracefully to give the correct answer, and for this Christian to benefit greatly from the advice of the priest. Unfortunately, there have been temptations on the part of priests to request obedience or to demand their words to be received as words of a person who has authority over the parishioner, who has spiritual authority to command and demand. And on the other side, there is a temptation from unfortunately not mature Christians, who look to deliver to somebody responsibility and the common sense. So they, I would say it better, who look to abdicate from their responsibility and the common sense.
this question is sort of controversial for some people. For other people, it makes total sense. But I'd like, if you can, try to give us your insight on this. So in Ephesians, during the wedding service, for example, this is read, I think, during the wedding service. So there's a part where it says, so, "Wives, submit yourselves to the husband." And this has been a verse that is quite controversial, and especially in modern times in America, because it's sort of looked at as the man is better than the woman. And a lot of people, when they see the word submit, they sort of translate that as to obey your husbands, or become his slave. Some people will go as far as to say that. So what are your thoughts on that verse, and what does it actually mean?
First, on the question about inferiority of women compared to men. Well, women have the same value, spiritual value, same value to God as men. They have different roles in the church, different roles in the family. So I would not agree that women are inferior to men. With regard to submission, this verse comes immediately after another verse, which says, in which St. Apostle Paul exhorts the Christians to submit to one another. So why is necessary this verse, women to submit to their husbands? This is a very difficult verse for the commentaries of the Holy Scripture. So this verse, it speaks about the order in the family. But what kind of order? We have divine hierarchy. We have hierarchical relations in the church. And a family, as a small family church, is natural to have its hierarchical relations. But these hierarchical relations are not based on personal submission of one will over another. They are based on mutual concord. They're based on sacrificial love. They are based on care and responsibility. And the authority of the husband is a moral authority, which again stems from sacrificial love. Unfortunately, this verse has been used by many males who are not mature as persons or spiritually mature, who use this word to justify the exercise of their primitive passions, of anger, of desire to exercise power, and many other sinful passions and drives to abuse their wives, which cause a great disturbance in the families, destroys the spiritual life of the family, of the wife, of the children, and of these unfortunate men to great extent. In some cultures, and again this is the abusive reading in this abusive application of the high notions which we find in the Holy Scripture.
I was at a church one time, and there was a really good chanter at this church, and there was a person who was visiting the church, and he wasn't really a chanter, but he was up at the chanting stand. And he started sort of giving his tips and tricks to the expert chanter. He's like, "Oh, you should do this, you should do this." And I remember the expert chanter was just kind of accepting, you know, this moment, even though he could have easily said, like, "You don't know what you're talking about. I've been doing this for years," you know. But he was sort of, I guess you could say, he was being kind of like, he was listening to the person's advice and was sort of taking, like, almost like obedience, I guess, to some degree.
First of all, to be on the church stand and chant or to give orders, you need to have the blessing of the priest who is in charge of this church.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if the experienced chanter finds these advices fruitful, it's wonderful, and he's so humble to receive these advices from maybe a stranger. And of course, it obviously speaks that this chanter was indeed experienced and was able to immediately grasp the benefits of these advices. It speaks very good for him.
Well, let's switch gears to another, I guess, aspect of rules or obedience. Economia. This is something that some people don't, I guess, can't really fully grasp the idea of economia because it's. Well, first of all, I guess we should explain what economia is, because many people might not know what that is. So can you explain what economia is and sort of when it's applied?
Yes, I'm surprised that people are concerned with the issue of economia, because economia is something very specific to the pastoral practice in the church. So it concerns the priests and the hierarchs. Economia is application of the church rules, of the canonical rules of the church. And to make it understandable, I would use the analogy with healing of a diseased person. The church is a hospital. So the way to approach a disease of a patient, it comes from the discretion of the doctor, of the physician. For example, if you have a person with a cancer, usually there is a protocol how to treat a person with this specific kind of cancer. But there are health conditions in the patient that should be taken into account. So you cannot always imply strictly the protocol. So in this way, you choose another way to approach this situation, which does with the final aim or goal to heal the person. So application of economia is, well, something that requires, again, very high degree of spiritual and pastoral discretion from the person, so that he applies the rules of the church, the letter of the rule or the canon in a specific situation, or chooses another approach in order to spiritually heal the spiritually diseased man.
No, I guess on a sort of a more kind of like a common economia occurrence I can bring up. So would an example be something like if someone has a health condition and they can't necessarily, well, because we have fasting rules, of course, but maybe they need to have, maybe they need to drink milk or something, or they need to eat eggs. That could be an example, correct? Or yeah.
Yes, this usually economy is applied in these cases, and the fast is not so strict, or it is shorter, or it depends. Economia is applied in this example of application of the rules for fasting. In each particular case, the fast may be not so strict and it may be shorter. Again, having in mind the beneficial spiritual result of applying economia. For example, if a person cannot fast so strictly, and the application of the letter of the church rule in his case will be detrimental for the spiritual health or the spiritual condition of a person, the priest, if he considers so, applies economia, so the strict is not so fast or is not so long. But again, the goal is the spiritual benefit. It is not just lenience. You need to have this goal and to foresee, to try to be able to foresee the spiritual benefit of application of economia.
I think we've actually kind of gone over most of the questions here, but I did, something did pop up in my head. I was just thinking about it. So I think one of the biggest issues people have with just the idea of obedience is sometimes people are told to do something, for example, from a spiritual father, and they just don't understand why. You know, they just think like, why is he telling me to do this? Or why should I do this? And of course, you know, I guess at the end of the day, you're not really going to understand every single thing you're told to do.
Yes, of course.
You know,
yes.
and I think if you can give us sort of some advice on how we can take orders, or not maybe not orders, but how we can sort of, when someone tells us to do something and we don't know why we're being told to do this, like it doesn't make any sense why he's telling me to do this. What's a way for us to kind of work with that?
Well, this is a good opportunity. First, for the person who does not understand, to experience trust and love and openness, and to ask the priest, Father, excuse me, I do not understand. I trust that you have more experience than me. Maybe God enlightens you, but you know, it's hard for me to understand. Excuse me, but could you please explain me? And this is a very good opportunity that a priest, if he has the capacity, if he has the time, has the physical strength to do so, is to catechize the parishioner, explain the spiritual grounds behind his advice. This may give freedom to some people who are inclined to always argue and to always consider themselves right. And let me say, you know, Bishop Serafim told us to discuss everything with our situations with the priest, and of course you should be aware in such cases that if you have inclination always to insist on your opinion or to force your will to be accomplished, this is not a good, beneficial approach. You should always approach your father your spiritual father as your loving father, with respect and trust and love. And these mutual feelings, when then develop over time, are very beneficial for both the priest and the parishioner.
This all reminds me of a short story I read. It was a man who went to confession with his priest, and by the end of it, the priest said, "All right, so what I want you to do after this, we're done speaking with each other. I want you to take this bucket." He said, "I want you to take this bucket and I want you to fill it up with water." And the man heard that and said, first of all, he was like, "Why? That doesn't make any sense to me." And they said, "All right, fine." And he actually thought it was kind of funny because it's so easy. All I have to do is go to the lake and just, put my bucket in. And so he went to the lake or the river, and then he put his bucket in to fill it up with water. And it wasn't happening. Every time he would put it in, he would put it up and it wouldn't go in. And he was like, what? And so then he came back to the priest and he said, I'm so sorry, but I couldn't do it. And then a tear came from his eye, fell into the bucket, and the bucket filled up. And then the priest said, "All right, now you're good."
I didn't know this story. It is a moving story and beneficial. Such relations may develop with the time of a very deep trust. And so in very rare sentences, when through time a very deep relations are formed of, I will say it again and again, of love and of trust, of respect, when the spiritual child wants the Lord's will to be fulfilled or revealed through advices of the spiritual father, such miracle may happen. In very rare cases, an advice from a priest to try, please, abide to my advice, may perform a miracle. Again, it is not a demand, it is a request. Please abide. For example, if the priest sees that the spiritual child is possessed by a passion which the spiritual child cannot control, sometimes the mind, the will are paralyzed. So the only way to help in this situation is again to ask for obedience, to ask, please follow my advice. And there are instances in pastoral practice which again are very rare, but if the spiritual child decides to follow the advice of spiritual father, miracles happen. But again, these are very rare cases. They cannot be generalized. A spiritual child cannot demand such an approach from a priest, and the priest usually should not demand such an approach from a spiritual child. Now, these are very deep, and these miracles, these cases are beneficial. They work when the relations between a spiritual father and a spiritual child are spiritually matured, when they're very spiritually deep, when there is no immaturity or passions involved in this. Now, this is about people with high spiritual stature. Yes. It's not, again, a general rule.
Well, I think that will be the end of this episode, but I do want to say thank you very much for coming on to the show. And
thank you for inviting me.
I'm happy to have tea with you, and hopefully in the future, if you ever come back to Etna, we can have a different type of tea and we can have a different topic to discuss maybe.
I would be glad to have it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Grace.
Thank you, Timothy. Cheers.